Imagine that you are an upstart Italian composer working in the 1730s. You've just been hired to compose a new setting of L'Olimpiade, a recent opera by perhaps the most illustrious and popular librettist alive, Pietro Metastasio. If you're anything like Antonio Salieri, whose biography offers a rare glimpse into the operatic creative process, you begin your work by locking yourself in a room and reading through the libretto 3 or 4 times over, allowing its words to catalyze your musical imagination. Now, what information do we imagine springs out of this reading? Salieri's comments support the reasonable assumption that this information ranges considerably in its specificity. Some aria texts suggest only a vague sense of character or tempo, a lightning quick bravura aria here, a sentimental adagio there, but at other times, musical ideas leap out of the libretto as if they were always already there. In the middle of Act 2, for instance, following an immensely tragic scene that tears the opera's central pair of lovers apart, your eyes fall upon the aria Se cerca, se dice, and a rhythmic tapestry unfurls before you. As a native Italian yourself, you know precisely how this text should be declaimed. Se cerca, se dice, which sets your basic melodic rhythm. Equally obvious is the orchestral accompaniment, which you immediately grasp should form a rhythmic canon with a melody. Rest bum bum bum, rest bum bum bum. We know this because this same texture can be found in a host of different arias that, like Se cerca se dice, are made up of 6-syllable lines, what Italians call scenario verse. Indeed, Aldara and Pergolesi, both of whom set the opera before you did, used precisely the same texture to open their settings of the same aria. You don't know these settings yourself, but you don't have to. You, like countless before you and countless after you, simply read Metastasio's text, and a fully formed opening gambit appeared like magic in your mind's ear. This moment we are imagining, where a musical feature is seemingly read directly from a poetic stimulus, is admittedly just one piece of the operatic creative puzzle, but it is both an intrinsically interesting and aesthetically central piece. Many critics regarded operatic composition as if it were a kind of expert perception. Good music, as they saw it, exists already within a well-crafted libretto. It needs only to be grasped by an especially sensitive musician. As Ranieri de Calzabigi put it, quote, the harmony that even a cursory reading enables us to discover in Metastasio's verses immediately strikes our composers, supplying them with the musical splendor that elicits admiration and respect from even the most biased. And yet, Metastasio himself acknowledged the, quote, alluring and infinite variety in the airs of different masters to the same words, speaking to a contrasting value of poetic flexibility that allowed these texts to remain musically relevant for decades after their initial premiere. Hence, there is a palpable tension at the core of Italian opera seria. A good libretto simultaneously needs to constrain the range of musical possibilities while also being amenable to a variety of different music. This paper addresses this tension by sketching a cognitive theory of libretto-cued composition. The theory endeavors to identify which features of a libretto were understood to have fixed or constrained musical implications, and which were more flexible in their realization, thereby allowing analysts to look at a libretto and reasonably guess what a musical response to it would probably sound like. Drawing on models of musical meaning developed by Robert Hatten, I claim that where features of a libretto are marked, that is, rare, special, or striking, their musical affordances are specific, and the range of appropriate compositional responses limited. Metastasio's libretti, which were set hundreds of times over by composers throughout the 18th century, provide a productive repertoire for testing the theory's basic claims. In essence, the theory predicts that settings of Metastasio's texts will converge at their marked elements and diverge at their unmarked elements. In our brief time today, I'm going to explain the basic outlines of how this theory works and exemplify it with respect to two well-known phenomena in Italian versification. First, the association of a marked verse ending with musical cadences, and second, the association of marked poetic meters with a constrained range of musical rhythms. From these brief analyses, I hope to sensitize you to the cognitive structures that subtend the creation of music from the reading of poetry. And I conclude by speculating a bit about what we stand to gain from attending to these structures. So the theory starts with markedness, a concept familiar to any of us who have spent time with semiotics in the past 3 decades. Markedness is a concept from linguistics that refers to the asymmetrical ascription of narrow meanings to structures that are rare or special, that is, marked, in relation to some unmarked norm with nonspecific meaning. Singular noun forms, like lion, for instance, are unmarked and can be used to refer to both individuals and groups, as when we say,
"The lion's trump card is the group hunt."
Whereas plural forms are marked and hence specialized, referring only to groups and never to individuals.
"Lions attack with the precision of a pro football team."
Robert Hatten made markedness a central term to music theory in his landmark Musical Meaning in Beethoven, when he pointed out that musical structures can also be interpreted in terms of markedness relations. Major versus minor, perfect fifths versus tritones, root position versus inversions. Each of these relationships involved an unmarked element with broad meaning, against which a marked second element acquires its more specific meaning. Markedness allows Hatten to systematize the process of musical interpretation. Through it, he establishes specific routes of translation from musical sound to conceptual meaning. The theory I articulate here is also based on markedness, but it reverses the interpretive flow. Instead of going from sound to meaning, that is, we will move from poetic features to sound. This is the essence of the theory. Just as marked musical elements constrain the range of our interpretations, so too, I'm saying, do marked textual elements constrain the range of musical realizations. For example, let's look at the aria Più non si trovano and consider the three ways, and only three ways, that a line of Italian poetry can end. These three endings are quite clearly arrayed in a markedness relationship, featuring a central unmarked norm and two marked alternatives. The unmarked ending type, known as the piano or literally plain ending, consists of an accented penultimate syllable and an unaccented final syllable. As in the second line, by tacking on an additional unaccented syllable at the end of the line, you produce a marked strucchero or slippery ending, as in the opening line. This is an ending marked by the addition of a syllable. Whereas by chopping off the final unaccented syllable, you produce a tronco or truncated ending, as in. Note how Metastasio reserves tronco endings for the final line of each stanza. This is the special meaning of this marked verse ending. Tronco lines close stanzas. They mean poetic conclusion. And as closing devices, they have specific musical implications. What do you do as a composer when you see a tronco ending? You write a cadence. Hence the translation process I'm theorizing here. A marked poetic element, like the tronco ending, has a specific musical realization, a cadence, whereas the unmarked piano ending bears no such implications. As an unmarked ending, the musical implications of the piano ending, one might say its musical meaning, is unconstrained, whereas tronco's musical implications are very specific. This example shows the theory in a nutshell. The basic notion that generates the theory is what is called markedness assimilation, or the tendency for marked terms to cluster around marked contexts. Tronco lines and cadences, that is, are both marked in signaling devices, and they assimilate together at stanza endings. More generally, the theory proposes that in multimedia genres, marked features from different media will tend to cluster together, and because of this, they are more likely to become associatively linked, creating a conceptual lump of multimedia material that I call a markedness correlation. In those multimedia genres, where one media serves as a foundational stimulus for another, as in Metastasian opera seria, in which pre-existing librettos continuously generated new musical settings, these correlations acquired the directionality of a cue. Marked features in one medium elicit specific corresponding elements from the other. In other words, marked textual features cue an associatively linked musical response from a composer, whereas unmarked ones have no strong associative links and thereby leave open a range of possibilities. Markedness correlations functioned as a communicative medium, linking librettist and composer, allowing them to communicate even at a distance. When, for instance, he writes two tronco lines in the first stanza of Se cerca si dice, Metastasio is actually telling the composer to approach this stanza as a pair of cadence concluding phrases. Actually, he tells them more than this. By marking, literally, line 2 with a question mark, Metastasio invokes a further markedness correlation that links questions to half cadences. Hence, this poetry communicates a quite explicit musical form, Its marked elements script a period-like structure consisting of an initial half-cadence phrase and a concluding full-cadence phrase. Through the cognitive medium of markedness correlations, Metastasio is able to shape a musical phrase directly through his poetry. Now that we understand how the theory works, let's return to the scenario imagined at the outset of the paper, in which our gallant selves read a whole texture from the opening line of Se cerca se dice. Act 2 was the result of a markedness correlation, one that links marked poetic verses to a constrained range of melodic rhythms. Let's explore how this correlation works, which will require us to delve a bit deeper into Italian versification theory. The first thing to recognize is that Italian poetry is metrically classified according to how many syllables are contained in a line's piano form. Più non si trovano, for instance, is a 5-syllable binario aria, whose opening structural line contains an extra syllable which isn't counted. Meanwhile, Se cerca se dice is a 6-syllable scenario aria, and the opera's first aria, Superbo di me stesso, is a 7-syllable or settenario aria. A poetic meter specifies which syllables within a line are accented. Some accents are fixed on obligatory syllables and are hence known as accenti obbligati, whereas others, known as accenti causali, are more flexible in their position. Settenario verse, for instance, contains 2 accenti obbligati that fall on syllables 4 and 6, as well as 1 accento causale that might occur on either the first or second syllable. Importantly for musicians, Italian theorists like Carlo Rittoni required musical settings of Italian poetry to place accenti obbligati on strong beats of a measure, but did not require the same of accenti causali. This entails further that meters that contain only accenti obbligati demand rigid alignment at all times between poetic and musical meter, whereas those that contain one or more accenti causali allow for greater flexibility. The chorus O care selve o cara is a settenario verse, with an accenti causale on either O or cara, and so you see composers ranging considerably in what they choose here, some choosing to begin with an upbeat-oriented phrase, and others choosing to begin on a downbeat. This is the inherent flexibility of working with settenario verse. And so it's here that we find our markedness correlation, for in Metastasio's practice, verses that contain at least one accento causale, like settenario, ottonario, and quinario, account collectively for 87% of Metastasio's output, forming a clear unmarked norm against which verses with only accenti obbligati, that is, scenario, decasillabo, and quinari doppi, emerge as marked alternatives. Centering scenario verse in our focus, we see that this verse type cleaves into a pair of amphibrachs anchored to accenti obbligati on syllables 2 and 5, which serve in turn as synchronization points between poetic and musical meter. Assigning these accenti obbligati to downbeats allows us to derive a limited number of rhythmic archetypes for this verse. 3 such realizations are shown above, 1 triple meter profile and 2 with a duple profile. And as a side note, for our purposes, there's no meaningful difference here between duple and quadruple. The triple meter profile is durationally uniform, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is a consequence of the isomorphic cardinalities between musical pulses and the syllables of an amphibrach. The duple profiles, on the other hand, are rhythmically heterogeneous. Specifically, the 2 duple realizations are distinguished by their treatment of the verse's third syllable. Realization A situates that syllable on the second metrical subunit of a bar, like the second eighth note of a 2-4, producing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Meanwhile, realization B places that same syllable on the measure's third subunit, granting additional agogic weight to syllable 2 in the process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Thus, the rigid accentual profile of the marked scenario meter assimilates with a relatively constrained set of plausible musical realizations, precisely as predicted by the theory of markedness correlations. Indeed, these 3 realizations capture the opening melodic shapes of every scenario aria in all 3 earliest settings of l'Olimpiade. These include not only Se cerca se dice and Non so donde viene, the 2 scenario arias penned by Metastasio, but also the substitute aria E troppo spietato that appears only in Vivaldi's setting. From these examples, we can see that Vivaldi is unique in choosing a triple setting for every scenario aria in the opera, as if it were a special proclivity of Vivaldi specifically. More significantly, however, we see that Caldara and Pergolesi agree not only on their duple A treatment of Se cerca se dice, but also on using duple B to open Non so donde viene. This, in my view, feels like a natural fit for both texts. The twinned clauses and intervening comma of Se cerca snap especially easy onto the paired rhythmic motives and intervening rest of duple A. Whereas in non so, grouping of syllables 3 and 4 into a single word suggests a rhythmically proximate treatment of these syllables, as in duple B. Once this translation of poetic verse into melodic rhythm has taken place, the resulting shape enters into a web of dialogue with other musical relationships. We'll note that duple A, for instance, leaves open a metrically accented gap at its midpoint, which, as we saw in the introduction, Gallant composers routinely filled in with a rhythmically displaced copy of the pattern performed by the orchestra. In this way, a basic correlation between marked verse types and a small range of rhythmic realizations becomes an anchor for a much larger conceptual network, allowing composers to read whole textual complexes from a single line of poetry. These are just two instances of Markedness correlation among countless others evident in the opera seria tradition. There are many more to discuss even in Se cerca se dice, which, for instance, has a marked number of stanzas, 3 instead of the usual 2, that correlate with specialized musical forms, as well as a special tendency to skip the opening ritornello that seems to be correlated with marked aspects of its aria type, position in the act, and framing by the preceding recitative scene. At bottom, the theory claims that unmarked aspects of a libretto are flexibly realized and unspecific in their implications. But at marked moments, the libretto is asking a composer to do something specific, to use a specific rhythm, musical schema, form, or other procedure. The case studies here were designed to illustrate the cognitive dynamics of how this musical signaling works. And in my last minute or so, I'd like to ask what we gain from attending to that dynamic. At the most local level, I think the theory allows us to be more sensitive in our analyses, especially about musical borrowing and convention. Daniel Hartz, for instance, writes that Caldara's texture for Se cerca se dice was probably suggested directly by Metastasio himself. And he joins several scholars in viewing the rhythmic similarities of Caldara and Pergolesi's settings as evidence of direct influence, as if Pergolesi had actually heard Caldara's setting. I think both claims are wrong. Caldara didn't need Metastasio to suggest what would have been plainly evident to him from reading the text. And because it was felt to be evident, Pergolesi didn't need to know Caldara's setting to arrive at the same texture. And there's really no evidence that Caldara's music was heard beyond its initial premiere. At a broader level, I hope the investigation has provided us with a way to navigate that tension in opera seria aesthetics between the fixity and adaptability of a libretto, helping us to see where a libretto's affordances were wide and where they were narrow. And this, I think, has some interesting implications for corpus study. If, as I argue here, marked poetic features constrain musical realizations, it follows that arias with a greater degree of marked elements should generate musical realizations that contain substantial musical similarities, whereas those centered on unmarked structures will tend to diverge. I think that this is a testable hypothesis, but I will say that Se cerca se dice, the aria we've spent the most amount of time with today, famously generated a rich musical tradition structured by its own robust dialogic network. And I think the theory developed here helps to explain why this occurred. Finally, the basic theory as formulated here, in principle, applies to any multimedia genre. And just how far does the theory of markedness correlations take us? Do text musical relationships in the madrigal, lead, or Broadway musical also rely on markedness correlations like this? Do marked musical choices correlate in similarly specific ways with marked visual effects in film, or with marked bodily movements in dance genres? I leave these questions for you all to consider. But at bottom, I hope I articulated an expanded role for markedness in musical analysis. For beyond allowing us to hear meaning, texts, and stories out of music, markedness allows us to hear the music that sleeps within texts. Thank you.